Okay, everybody, welcome back. Glad to have you here for this month's edition of From Enemies and Strangers to Friends, Overcoming or at least Navigating Cultural Differences and Divides. We have a great guest this week. I'm very enthused about this. I'm very enthused that I came across her last fall. Elizabeth Bernstein is a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. She writes a column on bonds on relationships, which explores social psychology and different aspects of human interaction. In her column, she focuses on how we can best relate to others and to ourselves. She's been at the Journal for 20 years and has also covered higher education, philanthropy, psychology, religion at the Journal, all areas where personal relationships are huge. Her work has ranged far and wide, from exposing backlash against excessive emailing of baby photos to detailed narrative constructions of matricide. That's quite a range right there. She's received awards from organizations including the New York chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists Deadline Club, the Education Writers Association, and the American Psychoanalytical Association. She received her bachelor's degree in journalism and English from Indiana University, where I teach and where we're coming from in Bloomington, Indiana, and a master's degree in journalism with honors from Columbia University. She's also completed a Knight Science Scout Journalism Fellowship at MIT, which focuses on brain science, something that we've talked a little bit about through this vlog over the last couple of years, last couple months, and a Rosalind Carter Fellowship in Mental Health Journalism. Now, this last part is one that's very hard for me to say, but she lives in Miami where she's an avid sailor and scuba diver. We don't have a lot of that in Bloomington, particularly in February. It's a cold day. We got the swimming pool out here, but it's kind of frozen right now, so I don't think you could do much with it. So anyway, welcome, Elizabeth. I mean, this column that this vlog that we've been doing has been talking about how human beings who might otherwise disagree significantly on political and social issues might find a way to communicate with each other and cross over the divide, which is all about social psychology and personal relationships. And so while we've had some people that have talked about film as being a tool or religion as being a tool or sports or music or whatever, this is a different take on it and just kind of thinking through of what's going on in these relationships and how do we use whatever tool that we use in order to cross those divides. But first, I think to help our listeners, it might be helpful for you. I know you're working on a book. It's not out yet, but you're working on a book, and we'd be interested in what you're working on.
So my book is based on my column. So my column is about how to improve adult relationships. And I think of that as any personal relationship we have of any kind, family, friends, spouses, but also our relationship with ourselves, like ourself. How do we improve that relationship? How do we take care of ourselves? How do we keep our mind going in the right way we want it? How do we adjust our thoughts really and cope with our emotions, adjust our emotions? So I've been at the Journal 20 years, as you said. I've been doing this column for 10. Almost 11. And so in that time, I've looked at a lot of research across all sorts of fields of psychology, social psychology, communication. And so I feel like I've learned a lot, and my column is a self-help column. So I always give advice in it. So my book is actually tentatively titled, Take My Advice, I'm Not Using It, because I've learned so much. And I'm road testing the title here as we go. But I've learned so much in this column, and there's weeks where I sit down and I'm telling, like last week, so many readers of the Wall Street Journal how to have a mental fitness regime. Here's how to help your mental fitness right now at this terrible time of this pandemic. And then, I'm logging off when I finally file and we publish this, and maybe having a mini meltdown, or so stressed out. I'm not functioning at my optimal ability now. So it doesn't always work at home. What I know to be good doesn't always work at home. That's what my book is about. A little bit of the research, the very best relationship advice I've learned in the 10 years I've done this, and then how did it work at home?
That's great. That'll be a great book. I bet you get a lot of sales, I think, on that one, and a lot of people that you'll be helping on that one. I'll look forward to getting that
help
myself.
some people,
Good,
myself included.
No better place to start than home, right?
Right.
So,
That's right.
so So that you all know, I first came across Elizabeth's work. It was in the fall, and I saw her column in the Wall Street Journal, and she was doing an interview with this organization called Braver Angels, which I had heard about before. But it was interesting to me in reading Elizabeth's column that day that braver angels try to facilitate conversations with people who strongly differ on social and political issues, kind of what I've been talking about here. But one of the things in particular that struck me is that Elizabeth had related that the participants in those conversations said that some of the conversations drew from their shared interest in things like sports, dogs, music, film, that were conversation starters so that they could get into the more difficult issues. And those are also the kinds of things that we've been talking about in this vlog. And so I was wondering, based on your work on personal relationships and social psychology, what is it about these conversation starters that provide the entry point for conversations? And are they just entry points like how's the weather today? Or is there something deeper that goes on with these talking about dogs and sports of lessons or commonality that we can build from?
I think it's such an important question, a good one, but so important. I believe that these commonalities are everything. It's what we have. It's what holds us together in our personal relationships as a society. I think they're the foundation, really, of starting something. And you mentioned weather. I don't think it's any accident or coincidence that weather is the biggest part of small talk. You get in an elevator when we used to get in elevators, and you how's the weather? It's because it's the one thing you're sure you have in common right there. So that's why. So I feel that when we can look for those commonalities, we can build a relationship, an acquaintance, whatever we need. But right now, unfortunately, in this country, we've sort of stopped doing that. That's part of the problem. We're seeing only differences instead of what's common.
Right, right. I was teaching a class. I mean, you're preaching to the choir here because I think that that's exactly spot on. But I was teaching a class earlier today, and we were looking at some famous people who had done something to overcome cultural divides. And one of the video clips was from Morgan Freeman talking about Nelson Mandela. And one of the things that I remember him saying in the video was when Mandela was in prison, that one of the prison guards had a child who was sick. And one day the guard came in and Mandela just said, "How's your baby?" And it was one of those things that really altered the relationship. And he's still the prison guard, he's still the prisoner. And I'm sure the guard wasn't one of Mandela's top 100 people that he liked in life either, but it made it human. And it gave a common thing that they could talk about, a touchstone, a starting point. And that is, I agree with you 100%, so much of what we have lost, in part because of the pandemic and being siloed and stuff like that. But it just seems like we have more and more difficulty finding common ground. And with that, I guess my second question for you is, with that difficulty of finding that common ground, um, where's the best place, like physical place, to try to find it? Is work one of those places where you would find it, or is it the cafeteria? Is it the stadium? But where do we find those places? I mean, it used to be, thinking back, to the whole, Robert Putnam kind of, arguments of the bowling clubs and the
Mhm.
and the church choirs and things like that. Are there places now where we're most likely to be able to have those kinds of conversations?
There are places, and unfortunately right now with the pandemic it's much harder because many of us don't go to those places. Many people are working from home, or not going out to the restaurants and things that they would in a normal world. So I myself don't, and so I find it, I work from home, and so it's much harder than where I mean, you could find common ground in an airplane seat. Let's just talk about a normal world. Right next to you, I've had some really interesting conversations, because I'm a talker, with people sitting next to me on a flight. I try not to bother them if they're not talkers, but you can tell when somebody wants to talk. And also, so you have nice conversations. I've made friendships. friendships and stayed in touch with people and made good friendships, that have, maybe not my best friends, but people that I know and check in on. And so right there, that's something, you have something in common. You're leaving one place, you're going to another, you're sitting on this plane, there's weather outside the window, there's bumpiness or not. You have so many things, the beverage cart didn't come by yet. You have all these things in common to, sort of discuss. You have all those openings, and that small talk again is your opening to trying to find the common ground. And I think too many, again, like our what we have to do is not go to our default. I feel like we all too often go to the default. Oh, that person doesn't look like me. Oh, that person probably doesn't vote like me. That, and so you're looking for that, and then your guard is up because again, these are tense times. But so back to your original question, it could be Starbucks. You could find people. Work is a great place because we still talk to our coworkers. So work is a great place. I've found commonalities. I really go back to this conversation I had, around Christmas time when I had to return something, gift I was buying, and I talked to customer service, something I hate to do. I don't have patience. But then the woman was so nice, and I said, "Where are you?" And she said, "Georgia." And then we're off on a roll because I really wanted to know what Georgia was like at that moment. Georgia has been big in our news. And so here we are. We talked for about 20 minutes. She said, "I'm going to get fired if I don't, get back to work." But it was it was this lovely, lovely commonality. I could have thought, oh, this customer service rep has nothing to do with me. But it could be anywhere, I guess, is my point. Anytime you see a person, it could be a good experiment. I like to give myself experiments. How about experiment? Look for the commonality and try to comment on it. Try to find it. Try to experiment. Can I start a conversation about some commonality? If you did, good. Chalk yourself up for a win.
So it sounds like that the opportunities, particularly, again, it's an odd time with the pandemic and everything, but absent that, I mean, life will return somewhat to normal, we hope. But that the opportunities to have those icebreakers, to find that common ground, to have that entry point in the conversation abound. It's more of your interest and willingness to take the chance to just engage in what's the
Engage.
weather, or yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you can look for people, you can look for areas certainly where you might have people who naturally have more in common with you, a hobby, if you join a club or a book club, or I sail, I belong to the sailing club here in Miami. So, you can find people who you already know naturally by virtue of where you're showing up, have something in common. But what I would like people to think about too is we have something in common with every human being. We're human beings. You start, we had mothers, we had fathers, like, so right there, maybe we all have, you might have kids. So to try to look not just for the people that are most like you, what's in common, but to remember we have something in common with everyone.
I remember when I was doing my PhD, it was at, you're a native of Chicago. I was doing it at Northwestern, and my professor was a guy named David Messick, who was an experimental psychologist. It was kind of interesting to have an experimental psychologist doing business ethics, which was my field, and he was one of the first people really to introduce serious psychology into the field. And one of the things he used to talk about of how malleable our definitions of what constitutes an us is and what constitutes a them is. And his example, which really resonated me since I was from downstate Illinois, is that you could have two residents of Illinois, one from Chicago, one from downstate Illinois, arguing bitterly about how government funding was going and spending money on roads. But then 2 seconds later, we're both cheering like crazy for the Chicago Cubs. I mean, and so at one point we're at antipodes, but the other point we're allies, and it could be instantaneous. And it doesn't take that much to want, if you want to find that alliance, that common ground, if you're willing to explore it. And it sounds like that's kind of the the goodwill. We'll use a Kantian term, the goodwill to try to want to have the conversation, as opposed to silo yourself in. Yeah.
Exactly. Years ago I wrote about deal breakers, and we're always looking for deal breakers in any relationship because, as from an evolutionary reason, we are primed to look for what could hurt us, the risk. This could
Right.
be wrong, that could be wrong. And so it's sort of our brain, our default is to look for those deal breakers. Well, this person's not like me. This person might hurt me. I'm saying, with some intent, you can be alert, but there's a lot to be said about looking for the commonalities first and trying to override that look for the deal breakers. And separately, I did write about strangers as well, something that I hope to write about again. Strangers are very important relationships. They're not really, a one-on-one relationship, but we're out there. If you think about it as a relationship, there's a lot of strangers to us at any given time, wherever we are, the grocery store or wherever. And strangers, our interactions with strangers, the more interactions you have with strangers a day, the less depressed people are. They are
Hmm.
a barrier against loneliness.
Hmm.
Just that little tiny conversation we have with a clerk, or for me, the customer service rep, the flight attendant, whatever it is, this is really important in keeping our social ability going. We're social animals. We keep that sociality going.
So this may be, to me, this is a hard question. For you, it may not be because this is your field. But for me, this is a hard question, and it came up in the class again that I was teaching this morning. So you've got the icebreaker. You've found some common ground. Whether it's the Cubs or whether it's the weather, whether it's the cart coming down the tray and the airplane or whatever. Um, the next step, if you wanted to actually talk about, or if you're ultimately would like to understand someone who really disagrees with you on a social or political issue better, to understand where they're coming from, it to find some deeper understanding and relationship with them, it's kind of an awkward thing of to go from we both like the Cubs to you want to argue a little bit about who's right, socially or politically. I mean, there's got to be an in between in there. So, I mean, how would what's a way to bridge the okay, we've established a little bit of a common ground, and it seems like that other person I'm talking to is a human being, and so that's interesting and stranger, and I feel good about that, but to take it to the next level where we're having the kind of conversations like those braver angel people that you were talking about. I mean, what's kind of the segue or the increments or where you go with that?
It's a good question. It's tough. I think for the Braver Angels, so what they do is interesting. They get people who they call Reds, people who are on the conservative end of the spectrum, and people who they call Blues, people on the liberal end, and they get them together. Now it used to be in person, but now it's on Zoom, and they get them together in groups of maybe 15, and they talk about issues. But the key there is it has several monitors, one who's red, one who's blue, and it's very structured conversation. So they have people who are trained to bring a group of strangers through this. So that's one model. And certainly Braver Angels, people can sign up and start groups, get trained, do this all over the country. So that's one way for people who are just interested in a political conversation. But separate from that, you're right. If just in a personal one-on-one or in person, we have to have, there's some middle between hi, it's rainy out, oh gosh, I forgot my umbrella, and let's talk about politics,
Right.
or let's talk about taxes, let's talk about death, any of the things they say you should not talk about. But think about it, even with our siblings or our parents, we might not have those conversations either. So it's not just people who aren't like us. It might be people who are the most like us in many, many ways, who are related to us. We still don't always have these conversations. So what I think is what helps is to form those relationships. If you can form a good relationship, and if it can be based on what you have in common, say you go to the dog park with your dogs. I'm a dog lover. I can see your painting, and we've discussed dogs a little. But if you can, if you start, hey, you have a neighbor, do you want to walk our dogs every day before work? Something, if you can start something that is consistent, and then you build a relationship there, and you talk about other things, your family, how is your child who's sick? How are your folks doing? Did you read that book? Any of these things, there's really quite a few to look for, dozens and dozens of commonalities to look for. And once you build that, you're building trust, and you're building like a bond. I'm doing this, you can't see in my lap. And so you can start to say, I don't think that, I don't know, I wouldn't say, hey, you want to talk politics, but it'll come up naturally. Things will come up. And then instead of bracing yourself, oh no, this is going to come up, I don't want to talk about it, I know we don't agree, you could listen first, always listen, right? There's an idea.
Yes.
Any psychologist will tell you, I'm not a psychologist, I'm a journalist, but any psychologist will say listen first. So you can listen and really listen. Don't listen, just listening isn't being quiet, waiting to speak. Listening is really taking in and trying to understand, and then you can speak. But I think these harder talks should come up more organically after you've tried to build something.
So it sounds, one, to come up organically, and second, that it might take time. That this isn't
Take some
necessarily
time.
the building of trust in a relationship isn't necessarily instantaneous, and so it may take a little bit of while before you work up there. But that doesn't mean that you might not be able to have the conversation at some point.
Exactly. And it's likability, I think. Like once you
Yeah.
like somebody more, you're more willing to, sort of listen to their view. Okay. And I have a good example. I do a lot of volunteering with veterans, and I do it with one group here in Miami that takes veterans who are disabled. Sometimes it's a psychological disability, like a PTSD, and sometimes it's physical, but they take disabled veterans diving and sailing and kayaking and we have this great resource here, the ocean. So we use it to help get them out, fight isolation, depression, all of this. So I'm very involved in this group, and I dive and I sail, and these are mostly men, mostly very different background from me, very different politics usually from me. Everything couldn't be less, together. You'd think but what do we have? We sail, we have diving, but also we had this awesome time. We went out
Mhm.
and we left our troubles, on land, and we went out, we had this great day, and then we had lunch. And so we started to build relationships. And I could say one or two of these people are now some of my best friends, my very best friends who were there in very hard times. I had a hard time. My father was sick recently, very hard times. These are the guys who show up. These are the friends who show up.
Yeah.
So there, now you have a commonality to say, hey, by the way, when you made that comment, I don't agree with that. Let me, when you made your political comment, just, so you know. And what happens? Now we tease each other. Yeah, I don't think that, you're wrong. Yeah, no, I'm right. And you have even the jokey, the laughy, like, I like you, you're my friend. Now we have a better way to talk about this, even though we still disagree.
Becomes a much thicker relationship at that point, and you can draw on those various kinds of strands. Yeah, that's a really good point. I like that a lot. Since you raised dogs, I just wanted to share. I think I may have mentioned this in my very first vlog for those of you who have been trooping along with us for a long time, if any of you are out there. But just an example of how something as simple as dogs can make a difference. I've written several books, but there's been one book that I wrote that I've never been able to get published. Just never have been able to. I've tried all kinds of which ways to do it. Had a contract at one point, but it didn't work out. And it was on the afterlife of dogs.
Hmm.
What various religious traditions around the world have said happens to a dog or any animal after it dies. And one of the things that I experienced when I was doing the research for the book is that I could almost walk up to a complete stranger and engage them in a conversation starting off about dogs, and then I would say, you know what Hindus think happens to a dog after it dies, or it could be a Buddhist or whatever. And if I had walked up to the person and said, do you know what my Hindu beliefs are about the afterlife? It's like, no, you don't talk. That's one of those things you don't talk about. You don't talk
So
about military
religion's
things.
right up there.
But be able to say that, do you know what Hindus believe? Or again, I'm just picking Hindus. It could be any tradition. People lean forward and they're kind of interested because it's safe. I mean, you're not talking about their salvation or someone else's salvation, or maybe you're talking about a dog. While we all love our dogs, it gives you a little bit of a space to be able to, what? It's a curious thing. But now if you start talking about it, when you're starting to educate each other, and so there's some religious literacy, and now it opens the door for conversations that could be impossible to have on religion, just because you had a safe entry point to get into it. So I totally agree with you that these entry points can really provide, sometimes it's quick, but sometimes over a long term, really create these kinds of thick relationships where you can talk about harder things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I guess my last question for you is, it's just a very open-ended question. I mean, you have advice? You know, I mean, you've been writing this column for 11 years. You've seen a lot. You've interviewed a lot of people. Just any advice that you would have of our world today or our country today, of anything that any of us can do in order to improve the situation. I mean, we can always look to the, you know, to the television to see what they're doing, or the leaders and what they're doing. But I always believe that leaders are able to do a lot more when people who they are leading are kind of leading them too. That are giving
Exactly.
them the foundations of, you know, we can get along with each other. Why can't you? But I don't know if that's necessarily true these days. And so, you know, just anything that any person watching this could do that you think would improve kind of our social and relational climate.
Well, I think that there's a lot. It goes back to what we're talking about. Like, I would again encourage people to really look for the commonalities. That's something you can do every day. And like I said, you can almost train yourself. And I'm going to look for the commonalities. But also, I'm a firm believer in volunteering. And I am of the opinion that too few people volunteer in this world. And not to get preachy, but there's so many things you can do. And it doesn't have to be even that you join a charity. You can have an elderly neighbor right now who doesn't feel safe going to the grocery. I mean, I know we've heard that example over the year, but you could anything. For example, right a block from my house is this lovely bakery that makes the best chocolate croissants ever, but they are going out of business. They didn't make it through the pandemic, unfortunately, but they have a GoFundMe page. Okay, do I have a few dollars that I would have spent on croissants going forward that I can help their GoFundMe page, so hopefully they get back on their feet in my neighborhood or any other neighborhood? So that's helping a neighbor, paying it forward. Like, so I would say, think of ways that we're all here together, not just in this pandemic, on this earth. And there are food banks, and there are children that need to be read to, and there's a million different interesting um, volunteering opportunities. Like I do, I dive and sail. How does that not help me more than the people I'm supposedly helping? So right, giving back always gives ourselves much. So I would say, think local, on the volunteering, not just the buying, on the giving, not just purchasing things. So think of how to improve your community, and think of your community could be your block, your building, your office. Like, anything. Bring, if you are going to an office, bring baked goods. Like, just, I'm big on the baked goods, can you tell? But but volunteering, and it's another way to have something in common, to meet people who might not be exactly like you, and start to broaden your world out. So try to think of the ways, I guess, to sum it up, that you can reach people in your community to help them, and to forge those bonds.
Boy, my wife will love this.
Good.
She is as passionate about volunteering as you are, and she works as a counselor for addiction, people going through recovery, and oftentimes there's a lot of depression that's also associated with people who are in addiction. And one of the very first things that she says is go volunteer,
Mm-hmm.
because it's going to help you
Better.
to volunteer, make you feel better about what yourself, and give you more control over the decisions that you make. And she's just very passionate about the personal benefits as well as the communal benefits of volunteering. It kind of goes back to your very first point when we started this, of, you know, making sure that you're taking care of yourself. Well, one way you take care of yourself is by giving yourself the opportunity to do something for others. It's kind of a
Mm-hmm.
reciprocal kind of relationship there. And when you were talking there about the importance of volunteering, that really hasn't come up in our vlogs to date. But I think that it is so important. It's such a great point for us to end on. So, Elizabeth,
Great.
that was wonderful. Thank you so
Thank
very much
you.
for being on our vlog today. We all
Thanks.
learned a lot, and I thank you again for coming, and enjoy that scuba diving, since I'm not going to be able to here in